welcome to the first ever IAG podcast. You're looking lovely there, Janet.
Thanks very much, Andrew.
And
nice,
Ben,
nice to be here.
Thank you. Very good. And Ben, you're looking your usual self. So,
hope so.
Yes, no, that's good. No, that's a good thing. It's a good thing. So, this is we're very excited because this is our first ever podcast. So, Janet, thank you so much for agreeing to be our first guest.
Well, I'm very happy to. Thank you for asking.
So, I'm just going to throw a question at you straight away just to get the ball rolling before we go for any proper introductions or whatever. The audience can get to know you if they don't already over time. And question I'm going to ask you, you've been in hotels all your life. What makes a great hotel in 2020? What makes the difference for a fantastic hotel?
I think I'm quite a purist. For me, the building, obviously, you need to have all the right facilities and, the latest and greatest, especially now in today's day and age with technology, because it's, everybody needs to be connected. But to be fair, I think the software, which is our people, is probably number one. If you think of Maslow's theory, people first, the hierarchy down the bottom of the triangle, it's really all about the software. I think you can have very, very old hotels, and there are lots of examples around the world, but if the people are good and well trained and they care about the experience, I think that just tops it off.
Mm-hmm. And so what, talking about, people, you just got me thinking there about the hardware software issue we often have in Macau. Often in Macau we have beautiful hardware, we have amazing buildings and architecture, but software is always the challenge. Yeah, how have you found that in Macau compared to all the other places that you've worked over the years?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the Macau caliber is a step above. Now, I've worked in secondary cities, I've worked in resorts, I've worked on tiny islands where it's been a very local staff, So, for instance, when, as an example, when I was in Phuket, all of my staff were local. There was only myself and one other expat. And I think what you get here is because of the type of business, because of the financial environment that we all operate in, you do get a higher caliber of people. You get the influence. For instance, in my two hotels, the Sheraton Grand and the St. Regis Macau, we have 23 nationalities. So it's interesting, right? So yes, there are, some areas which are more locally based, but I do think that the caliber of people here are very good. And it depends what you're comparing to. Like anything, there's always a pro and con in any destination. But for me, having gone through a lot of regional areas, this is quite good.
You find it? Sorry, go on, Ben.
Yeah, Janet, Andrew asked you before about, what makes a great hotel these days, but particularly looking at the Chinese consumer. And I guess, you deal with from premium down to mass market, but is there something particular that the Chinese consumer is looking for in a hotel?
I think their behaviour is one that is instant. I think they are a market. Actually, it's interesting because our guest voice, which is we have an external third party that measures what guests think of us. The Chinese customer rates us quite high. I think that providing they've got everything they need at their hand and they are connected and that they are a good customer to work with. They seem to be easier to deal with. I think there is an impatience, like I want to check in, I want this, I want that, but I actually don't think that's just Chinese. I think that's all markets. I think that's what the internet has done. It's about instant gratification. I think that's the biggest thing for us in hospitality is how do you meet that and keep the level of service, keep the staff trained. So it is a little bit of a push and pull when we're dealing with it. But I think our Chinese customers are just as demanding as any other geographical area.
Here's a question for you. The average stay in Macau, as we know, is like about 1.5 days. But I think that's the average between the day trippers and the overnighters. I think the average overnight is 2.2 or something like that. How does that compare at, say, so we should tell everyone who don't know, you've got two hotels, very, very, very different. Actually, maybe you want to talk about the two hotels that you specifically manage?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I manage the Sheraton Grand Macau, which has 4,001 rooms, 2 towers. So it's a Sheraton. It's the largest Sheraton in the Marriott network. Actually, I think it's one of the largest hotels globally across most brands. So there is a segment of our business which is gaming, but there's also a segment of our business which is wholesalers, MICE, for those it's meetings, social events, all that sort of thing, as well as just people that book online. So the traffic in our hotel is quite extensive. On the other end of the spectrum, and which is why it's nice to manage 2 brands, we manage a luxury property, the St. Regis Macau. That's 400 rooms. So in anywhere in the world, a hotel of 400 rooms is a decent gig to manage. But in our world, we talk about, oh, it's only 400 rooms because of the landscape that we deal with in Macau. But what's nice about it is that you've got then St. Regis, which is a hotel in its own right. It doesn't really back onto any gaming within its public areas. You walk out the door, of course, there is retail, gaming, all that sort of stuff. But, you know, the experience of our St. Regis customer is, with our guest voice statistics, elevated at a much higher level than it is at Sheraton. And it's just the different brands. You know, we have 50 butlers at St. Regis that take care of your every guest. So they're the 2 brands that I manage here. So, and it's actually quite nice because they complement each other and they don't erode each other's business because they both appeal to different markets.
I guess we should also say there's about 40,000 hotel rooms in all of Macau now, right? Roughly speaking. When I came to Macau 15 years ago, I think there was about 15,000. So it's really gone up. I mean, it's still a long way short of Las Vegas, which is 150, 60, 70,000.
Right.
But you've actually controlling more than 10% of the entire room stock of Macau. And the question I was originally asking you was average stay. So is the average stay longer at your properties? I mean, your properties are both 5-star. I mean, in Sheraton, even though there's 4,000 rooms, it's a massive hotel. It's still very, very nice. You know, it's a nice 5-star hotel. Is your average stay higher or lower than?
No, it's fairly similar.
Very similar.
It's still fairly similar because it's the MICE business isn't in double digits to be able to impact the length of stay. But, you know, just to give a comparison, you know, if you're in a resort, the average length of stay is about 3.5 days. You know, so what that allows you to do is get closer to the customer, get to know them, you know, find out if there's something the matter, help with recovery, all that kind of stuff. You don't get those opportunities so much here, more at the St. Regis than you do at the Sheraton because of the in and out. And it's just the dynamics of our business and also some of the more prominent market segments.
Janet, when we've just been talking about the scale of the operation you're looking after, I mean, 4,500 rooms is a lot of rooms. So just going back, I mean, I know you've worked all across Asia in a lot of places, but by comparison, I mean, where were you before you came to Macau? What sort of key count were we looking after at that stage?
It's interesting. I was at the Western Siri Bay on the east side of the Phuket Island, and my keys there were just under 300, 78. But I was in an area role, so I looked after Koh Samui, Cowlack. But even cumulatively, that was only like about 1,300 rooms. So it's much different. Nothing can prepare you to manage an operation coming into Macau unless you've had prior experience, and everything is amplified. So in a normal environment where you had in Phuket, I'd go and have drinks with my customers. I'd be able to go and have dinner. I'd get to know them personally. Here, it's a lot more difficult to do that because of the length of stay, but also because of the size and scope of the role.
So that was sort of that's exactly what I was about to ask you next. Is, I mean, coming into Macau and just going from 300 rooms to 4,500. I mean, it must have been a bit of a shock to the system, I guess. But what were the main challenges for you in just getting used to dealing with that size and scale that you had to deal with there?
You know, the interesting thing it was when I arrived on the 1st of September 2015. And the thing here was that you come in and then immediately the caliber of your leadership to me just stuck out. It was at a much higher level. You had more expats on our team. Like the expat group was in their 20s. You just don't have that in a normal property. So the caliber of people here is outstanding that you're dealing with in the leadership team. The other thing is, as I mentioned, is the interaction with the customer. That took a little bit of getting used to, because, you know, in hospitality, I don't have a gaming background. So in hospitality, your ethos is all about customer service. It's about building a culture where you like to serve and all of those things. You take a step back from there. And then you've got these two dynamic owners. At the time when I started, we were still Starwood, and then we had Las Vegas Sands, both big entities in their own right. And then at the same time, I think at the end of 16, Marriott bought Starwood out, which put in another component to this triage. So to answer your question, it's just the scope of what you do, and the role is very strategic, which I like a lot.
You mentioned about Marriott taking over Starwood. What was that like for you? What were the implications for you as a manager when that? I mean, that was a massive worldwide.
Yeah.
It's just a huge thing that took a long two massive hotel groups all around the world combining. I mean, have you got any stories from that time, or how it affected you?
Well, look, the thing with us is we were managing the largest property in the Starwood system, which then rolled over to the Marriott system, and irrespective of how long, even though, you know, your tenure with the company has just moved over to Marriott, but you were going to a company with different culture. That would happen in any business, and so it meant that there needed to be a patience of them learning us and us learning them. And there's plenty of case studies in this with acquisitions, and it was difficult to begin with because a different culture. You saw some of your colleagues that you knew for many years leaving or moving into different roles, which is also very normal in this kind of thing. I think Marriott brought a lot of great things to the table, which we had to learn. If you think of the changing of all of our IT systems, the changing of our loyalty programs. So the first year, it was about learning, even though we were the experts in our environment, and definitely about Marriott learning about how we operate in Macau. The lucky thing is that they operate a couple of properties in Macau, so they already understood the gaming perspective of our business. It was just our size, and our structure was a little different to the way they've structured. But, you know, I have to say that the leadership was always very generous. They were wanting to learn about. I don't really feel that we had a lot of issues, although it was painful because some of the system changes and stuff was just a big deal. When we changed, just as an example, when we changed our systems here to morph into the Marriott systems, we went dark for 19 hours. So if you look at doing something like that with our scale, it meant that from the July of that year, the changeover happened at the end of September, we were role-playing manual systems in order to go dark. And during that time, no one was checked into a room twice. No one was checked into a dirty room, or a vacant dirty room, as we would call it. And we had a war room where there was people that worked for nearly 72 hours straight without going to bed. And the lead up to all of that took nearly a year. So that was just one component, and that was a big deal, and that was such a big team effort from our side and also from all of the Marriott folks, not only in Asia but in the US as well.
That actually leads me to a question, Janet, about, I mean, Andrew mentioned before about the average length of stay in Macau is quite short compared to a lot of places, and with a hotel with 4,000 rooms, I imagine that means you're turning over rooms very regularly.
Sure.
And what sort of, I mean, how do you go about making sure that runs smoothly? You know, how many staff do you have on to make sure that gets done every day? Can you talk me through that process a little bit?
Sure. The peak check-in time, normally the check-in time's 3, but we open check-in early in the morning to try and get, move through some of the numbers. This is talking in a time when we're not in COVID, of course. So our peak check-in time's probably between 1 and 5 on a normal, what we would call FIT, which is frequent individual traveller in and out. in order to open our check-in, we really need to have 500 clean and inspected rooms. Because if you open your check-in too early and you've got 200 people, but you've only got 100 rooms clean, then you've got a lot of unhappy people wanting to check in. So that's the first thing. And then you just need to staff to that. So at any one time, we can look at the number of room attendants, etc., that are rostered each day to staff, and then they get a certain amount of time to clean and a certain amount of credits to clean each room. And then, you know, your workforce flexes according to that. But with the occupancies that we run, we never had a workforce that had nothing to do. We were always behind the 8 ball trying to get more staff, get more quota to clean our rooms. On the front office, in terms of the GSAs, etc., the guest service agents that check in the guests, at any one time we've got our main check-in desks, which is 26. And then there's an area specified just for our Sands Rewards customers, and there's check-ins there of 8 to 12. And then in full swing, when we're at peak over at the East Lobby, there's another 6 check-in desks. And then the club floor, where we've got another 6 to 8 check-in desks. If there was a MICE piece of business, we set up satellite check-in desks. The most we've ever done is for 52 check-in desks for when we've had an event for 10,000, which was a multi-level company out of China. So it's in full swing. It's very concentrated, and that's quite stressful for the operations departments. I have such respect for the folks that run this, because it really is a tough graft for them.
Well, it's really amazing to have 50 plus people, you know, checking in. And I guess when you have an event like that as well, they're all checking in for one day as well, to come for that one day for that event. So you don't have the luxury of some people staying 2 nights, which calms things down a bit for you.
Well, well, in those cases where we've had the conferences for 10,000, what we do as part of SANS is we bid for Cotai-wide events. So you'll find that there's some rooms booked at Sheraton, rooms booked at Venetian, rooms booked at Parisian or one of the other Sands properties. And the events run for 2 to 3 days. And there is a little bit of relief for us, because they're what we call in our business stayovers. But, you know, with 4,000 rooms, you can have 2,000 rooms set aside to that, but you've still got to check in another 2,000.
And I guess they're all coming at the same time and leaving. Even if it's 2 or 3 day event, they're all arriving on the same day and leaving on the same day. So you've just got this huge...
Yes.
Yes. I guess to put it in context for people who may not know watching this podcast, so your 2 properties, Sheraton and St Regis, are on the Cotai Strip. And on the other, directly over the road from you, is Venetian, which is 3,000 rooms.
Yes.
Parisian is 2.5.
It's about 26, 29.
Right. And I think all of the Sands properties have about 14,000 rooms, essentially all in the one, well, with the exception of Sands Macau on the other side, which I think is only 500 rooms, all pretty much within what you would say is walking distance of each other.
Yeah, and we work together collaboratively, because the way the complex is built, you can pretty much walk across all properties without walking on the streets, without getting in a bus, which is one of our USPs, I think, in Macau for all of our properties. If you've ever gone to a conference in Asia, in Bangkok or whatever, you can really get caught in traffic for 2 hours to go a kilometre. And obviously around the world, in the US, etc., some of these big multi-conferences are spread out quite a bit. Whereas I think that's a great USP for us here in Macau.
Although it does take a while, Janet, to walk from one property to the other. So big are they?
Yes, it does. And in high heels.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about that.
Then you should tell a short version of your story of walking from the Waldo to the Venetian. Go on.
I did, yeah. So first time I came to Macau was 2008, when the Grand Waldo still existed over where Broadway is now.
Yeah.
I was there for a poker tournament, and I didn't know Macau at all, and there wasn't much in Cotai at that time. There was the Venetian was the only, from memory, I think the only one open. So I remember walking out of Grand Waldo one day, because I hadn't left the casino for 3 days. I walk outside and I look over and I see the Venetian, and I think, okay, I might walk over there. No concept of exactly how far that was, and in Macau, middle of summer heat too. So about 30 minutes in, I'm walking along going, this is the most stupid idea I've ever had. I don't know where I am. There's nothing else around me. And so, yeah, I learnt my lesson pretty well that day, that the scale that we're talking.
I remember doing much the same thing my early trips to Vegas, because you look at the buildings are so massive, you think, oh, so
it's
close.
close.
It's close,
Yeah.
but it's not,
No,
half an hour
that's
away.
right. Yeah.
Janet, let's go back a little bit and talk a little bit about you. I mean, you most keen-eared people will hear that you have an Australian accent, but you've got a bit multicultural. Tell us a little bit about your childhood growing up, where you're from, going to university, that sort of stuff.
Okay, sure. My mum and dad emigrated in 1957 from Italy. And to look, if you've read any of those books where immigrants they either moved to Australia or they moved to the US for a better life, because everything was still in depression post-war. And so my mum and dad relocated to Brisbane, married, all that sort of stuff. And so it was interesting because my upbringing was, I had 2 feet in 2 camps. I desperately wanted to assimilate into the Australian environment, but actually I was brought up in a very Italian household. So my parents didn't speak a lot of great English, so I only spoke Italian at home, and we only did Italian things at home, cooked, all that sort of stuff. But then when I left the house, I then was in this Australian environment. So actually it's quite a nice mix. You've got a little bit of both. And so I grew up in Brisbane, and I did my MBA. I think I graduated, I started off as a paralegal and then got into hotels, and then I did a business diploma, and then I graduated with my MBA at Queensland University of Technology. I wanted to do contact time. I wanted to get out of the work environment, and because I think the benefit of those sort of things is the interaction you have in the classroom. Yes, there's the studies you have to do, but meeting, and I was a mature age student by then, so meeting other people and doing that was so beneficial. And I graduated in when I was 35 or so, and then my first foray into Asia was into a place called Nanjing. And at that time, Starwood only had 10 hotels in China, and which is interesting to the way it's all morphed. And when I was looking to move, it was always very difficult to move first as a female, which is not, I don't really like to say that, but it was really difficult. And so Starwood said to me, well, we'll put you in Nanjing because it's a secondary city. And so you can try yourself there. And then if it works, then we'll see what we'll do with you.
So you were already working for Starwood in Australia?
I was working for Starwood in Brisbane.
Right. And what was the catalyst for you wanting to come to Asia? It sounds like you decided you wanted to do that.
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to get out of Australia. I just, the whole idea of doing my MBA was what I was going to do was stay in Brisbane. And then what I was going to do is try and get into a different industry, in a related industry and I was trying to diversify myself. I had majored in strategic management and in new venture marketing, which is what I really like to do. Ultimately, I'd always wanted to leave Australia. And I think, if I have to think, that was probably a gene from my mum and dad. They did it, but also I think in places like Brisbane, I felt a little bit more restricted. I wanted something else, and I wanted to experience something. And actually, when I left, I said to mum and dad, I said, I'm only going away for 2 years, and then I'll be back, which is now 18 years that I've been away, and I've lived in a lot of places. And I've taken some assignments that perhaps weren't the most preferred assignments for others, but I think that's also helped my career and been able to give me visibility with corporate folks, owners, all that sort of stuff. But I've definitely had to put myself out there. But I mean, I'm sure other people have the same story, where they've had to take some jobs. But now there's lots of opportunities in Asia, which definitely didn't exist in 2002 when I left.
Geez, that like two decades ago, it was pretty hardcore to go straight to mainland China. And mainland China is still not that easy, but it's easier now than it was then. What was it like almost 20 years ago and a secondary city like Nanjing as well, not even Beijing or Shanghai? What was that like? Well,
needless to say, I was in a culture shock for a good 10 to 12 months. I went from 1.6 million people to 7. And it was in those days, it was listed as a hardship posting. So that meant, yes, so every 3 months they'd fly you out into Hong Kong and give you $500, which at the time seemed like a lot, and you would then go to Hong Kong. And it was almost like revenge spending that everybody's talking about now, you know, because you try and find a chemist to go and buy some of your toiletries and all that sort of stuff. In Nanjing, the property that I was located in, there was no Western. There was one shop, one bakery that was run by a German gentleman who made nice bread rolls. And every Saturday I'd get into a taxi and my secretary would have, you know, written the address on for me, and I'd go and have a tuna sandwich. And every Sunday we would go, a group of us would go 10-pin bowling. The good thing was you could take your own beer. So I'm a terrible bowler, but I like beer. So that seemed like a good mix. And then we would go go-kart racing. And there'd be, you know, 15 of us, all cultures. You know, there was French, Italians, there was some folks from Hong Kong, from Japan, etc. And then we'd go somewhere quite local for dinner. And it was always a good night out. And that was my existence in Asia. But it was really interesting and difficult. But it taught me how to be humble, because I think the thing about when you're in a place like Brisbane, you in Australia believe your own press a little bit. You know, there's a bigger world out there, but you don't know enough about it. I got thrust into this world which was the complete opposite of anything I ever knew. It actually taught me a lot about myself. You know, I didn't have the network, I didn't have the friends. So I think it was really good in the end, but painful.
Well, of all the places all across Asia that you've worked, have you got somewhere that you look back on as your favourite, not necessarily as the actual work, but just as a location in general? Have you got a favourite place that you've worked at?
I loved working in Bali. I thought Bali was beautiful. I thought the people are beautiful. And the jobs were lovely. I had 2 stints in Bali. My second stint, I managed a property at Tanalot, and there was a lovely golf course designed by Greg Norman. So that was very, very nice. So I loved that location. My favourite job, I was appointed as pre-opening GM of the 4 Points in Bangkok in Bangkok. So it was the first time Starwood had launched this mid-scale brand, and so I liked the job. I loved my people. It just hit every sweet spot. So professionally, I would think maybe Bangkok. Personally, Bali was tremendous.
I've stayed in that hotel. It's not a bad hotel, actually.
It's okay, yeah.
It's all right. Yeah,
mid-scale.
Quite good value for money too.
Yes,
what
it is.
What it is, you know. Yeah.
Sure.
So you've been in Indonesia, Thailand, mainland China, now Macau. Does that cover it, or any other countries?
Malay, yes. Nanjing, China, Bali.
Did I see KL on your?
KL, yes.
Yeah,
I was in KL for 3 years nearly. Back to Bali, Bangkok, Phuket, and now Macau. Yeah.
And has that always been with Starwood, now Marriott Group?
Yes, yes.
But they've got a huge range of hotels.
Yes, I've worked with 5 different brands, and in 2 of those roles, I had a corporate role. So even though you could think of my tenure as being with one company, each role was quite different and diverse. You know, branded was a different position. So it's been, look, Starwood Marriott, they've been tremendous to me. You know, I can only be grateful. Also, as a female, to reach a senior level, I do feel that I've been given as much opportunity and equal opportunity to all my other colleagues. I'm very grateful.
You mentioned before, Jenna, we were talking about the fact that when the Sheraton is busy, you had, at a maximum 50 odd check-in desks. Obviously, right at this particular moment, it's complete opposite. It's very quiet at the moment because there's no business coming in. What are you doing with your days now? How is it different for you in terms of what a normal day looks like for you when you're busy as compared to what it's like at the moment?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because in the beginning, when the pandemic started, it's kind of been a real evolution, because the first thing was scaling down as things started to evolve. So your crisis management skills, the communication skills, the fear of your workforce. I feel so sorry for a lot of our people, because everybody looks at me and saying, you can see them wanting the business to come back. So that was an evolution until we got to a level where occupancies had plateaued right out. Now my days are filled in trying to figure out how we're going to manage payroll, how we're going to manage our costs. I think we've got ourselves to a stage. It's not acceptable, of course, because it's still difficult, breaking even is difficult. And also, I think a lot of it is about managing the workforce, encouraging people to take their time off, keeping people employed, keeping people busy. And then another component of this is, obviously we work very closely with Marriott. We work very closely with our colleagues at Sands to make sure everybody's criteria are met. And then in my world at the moment, you may be aware that Sands Cotai Central is transforming itself into the Londoner. So there's a whole refurbishment component to this that I think keeps me quite busy. So there's kind of like 3 different components to this. So actually I'm busier now than ever.
I know in our business, with what's going on at the moment with the pandemic, it's been an opportunity to actually do some of those things that they're on your to-do list forever and you never get to them, but it's an opportunity. Are you finding, has perhaps the changeover from Sands Cotai Central to the Londoner, has it been ramped up, or have you been able to do things that you never thought you'd get to, or what sort of things,
I tell you what I do now is I read everything. I'm reading stuff from the hotel day-to-day minutiae, and then I'm having more time reading, all of your articles, because it gets to a time when you're fully operational where you don't have time to read about innovation. You don't have time to think, because we will have to do business differently. And to do that, you just don't go to sleep and wake up one day and say, well, why don't we do this? You really need to think about it, and you get more time to sit with your colleagues and say, okay, we've got this. What's a better way of doing it? Especially in the environment that we've got. I think the thinking time I'm very appreciative of, and it's something that you get less of, because your time gets hijacked, doesn't it? You may go to work wanting to do a set of things, but for all of us, it's the same.
I assume there's a bit of preparation now too, Janet, because we don't know exactly when the borders will open, but certainly the discussion's happening now. So I guess in some way it's sort of imminent. We don't know how imminent, but that's on your mind, that getting ready for the influx.
Yes, there is. We've got a little council of people of my executive committee. It's a smaller group, and we meet, and we're, our processes, what's going to change, how do we increase, some of the protocols that we've got in place to marry in with what Marriott's launched, to marry in with what Sands has launched, to make sure that when our guests come in and walk in through the door, that they feel safe. And that they feel secure, and that our staff feel the same. So yes, there's quite a lot of work that's being done on that.
And the other little factor, sorry Andrew, the other little factor is that Sheraton, of course, was a quarantine hotel for a while there, and I think the only quarantine hotel of the big IRs, really.
Yes.
I think I'm not sure what the final numbers were, but first of all, can you tell us about how that came about and what that was like to bring Sheraton online as part of it?
The dialogue with Sands was an MGTO happened to look for assistance with quarantine, and of course, we're always happy to help, happy to be part of doing something, because it actually is an assistance to the community. These things are never about making money, because in this current environment, that's not what we should be doing, the focus we should have. Putting the quarantine hotel together, I was never prouder of my team. We set up a room with games and coffee stations and everything, because I was concerned about my team feeling frightened. There's a level of that. And actually, it was always predicated to them that our first and first step was always to make sure that they were taken care of. So the Earth Tower where we are is a tower that can be locked off. and we built a little bit of hoarding, etc. So guests had access to check in, go up to their rooms, and no one else could get into that space. And like I said, I was really proud of my associates. They just said they were just happy to be helping and doing something. They said, "Oh, don't worry, Miss Janet, you know, we'll look after everything. We'll look after the guests." And that's the spirit to serve that I absolutely adored about my people. And in this little coffee station that we set up, it was actually a big ballroom, a meeting room rather, that we set up with them. We'd go up, we'd, you know, sit around, we'd have a chat with them, and then they would get into doing their jobs as they needed to for the, you know, because there were different parts of the day that they were busy and different parts of the day that they weren't. And I think overall the feedback and the media and some of the PR that we got at it was very favourable. And my front office, without any assistance or suggestion from myself, wrote a little farewell card to everybody. That's how we kept the associates busy. They hand wrote cards. "Thank you very much for being such a good stick," and off they went. So a lot of it's posted on the social media, and I'm very, very proud of the associates. I think they just embraced it and moved on.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Just on the COVID theme, because we are, I mean, for people that might be watching this in years to come, we're recording this on the 13th of May, right in the middle of the pandemic and the coronavirus pandemic. And one of the, you know, we're running this game platform at the moment that's we're talking about innovations and what might change, and how COVID, pre and post COVID, might be a bit like pre and post 9/11. You know, it might signal a complete change in how we do things. What do you think, as somebody in charge of hotels? Do you think, two-part question, first of all, what might change post COVID? What sort of like operating procedures, what, you know, the way we see things done in hotels, the way, just the whole process of going and staying in a hotel, particularly your hotels in Macau. And secondly, do you think that some of those changes might be permanent? They might be just, that's a new way we do things now.
There's two components to this. I think the first component is the customer, how they book, where they stay, how they travel, the type of things that they are looking for. I think there will be a heightened awareness. What we're seeing is from the research that Marriott has done is that the younger generation are throwing caution to the wind a little bit more than the older generation, because I think people, there's a pent-up demand. They want to get out, etc., etc. From an operational perspective, we've always had very strong protocols in our environment. I just think that those will be taken and lifted to the next level, and will need to be so until, you know, I think this will go for quite some time, until, from what I understand, some sort of vaccine is established for COVID. So our protocols internally, this is stuff we're all rewriting our standard operating procedures now. We're looking at everything. We're seeing what else that needs to be done. We're very robust in those areas anyway, but I do think that it's time to relook at it. And Marriott has got a global cleaning council. And on that council, they've got our heads of operations globally, but they've also invited some outside consultants from Ecolab to be part of our council to assist us with how we can do this better and to an elevated platform.
What about any specific operational things? Like, for example, I know you have in the club, you have the buffet. People are talking about, well, maybe no more buffets. Or I know in check-in, you have huge volumes of people at certain times of the day. Will you have people on the floor making sure that the crowds don't get too big, or staggering entries? Or, I mean, are there any specific initiatives you can talk about that will be different and might stay different?
Right. There's a lot of that we're talking and putting into play now. I can't really talk about it all because it's, you know, it's not all finite, but definitely the social distancing at check-in. You know, if you look at, say, as a case in point, somewhere like Sheraton, at any peak time, you could have up to 1,000 people. You know, one person checks in and then their family. Temperature taking, all of these things will need to continue. We obviously need to fit into whatever the Macau government says. You know, at the moment it's the health declaration, that needs to be cited for guests that are checking in. So all of these things will work in tandem with the government, and will also work in tandem with our own Marriott Council.
I think I read a story the other day, Janet, that a flight check-ins might take up to 4 hours for a while in the future, which Sounds like a nightmare, but first world problems. Are you expecting similar things in a hotel, or is that something I guess you're working through how to minimise that to a certain extent?
Yeah, we're working on how to minimise that. I think we have to also understand that I don't think business is going to come back, and I could be incorrect, to the 100% levels that we were enjoying a year ago, or in January, even before the pandemic hit. So there will be days where perhaps the occupancy is heightened. I do think that people will be a little bit more cautious about travelling, but definitely there will be some delays as we process temperature taking, all that sort of stuff. What we are talking about is how to automate that while people are waiting in line. We can have, but this all takes people, right? So we'll get people to take your temperature, we'll get people to view your health deck. So by the time you get to the check-in desk, some of that has already been actioned, which is something you probably can't do with an airline, but you can definitely do with us.
Maybe more in-room check-in, automated in-room check-in, that sort of thing?
Well, we do that at the St. Regis a lot. I think at the Sheraton, Andrew, that would be a bigger undertaking with 4,000 rooms, right? So I think this is a little bit of let's put the protocols in place and then keep tweaking them, because it's not something that we have a blueprint for, so there will be change, and we will need more people to activate it.
We've been being a bit too serious now for a while. I think we should ask you a few fun questions now.
Oh, okay, right.
So you've been working in hotels forever, and a lot of strange things go on in hotels. Come on, give us the goss. What's the craziest thing you've ever? I mean, in all your years, you must have seen some crazy stuff.
I have a lot. I'm not quite sure I can repeat it on.
I'm sure there's plenty you can't, but maybe one or two you can. Come on, must have some good stories.
Yeah, I think let me think some through. When I first started in hotels in 1988, the Expo was in Brisbane, and I joined in as a new chum, as we would use some of the Australian vernacular, and so I had come as a paralegal into hospitality. You couldn't get two areas that are so vast. And so I had a PR lady that worked in the department that started her day with a 10 o'clock hairdressing blow-dry appointment. And then after that, worked for 45 minutes and then went to lunch and only drank French champagne. She was called Madame Bollinger.
Okay, as you do.
As you do. And so this world was like, I came from quite a serious, restrictive environment into this world where even at a more junior level, you just went to lunch and drank champagne, and then, Melbourne Cup lunches and ballroom lunches, you'd go to lunch at 12:30 and then you just wouldn't go back. You shouldn't go back, because at some stages, sometimes the state you're in, you shouldn't go back. So that was in the 80s, so that was lots and lots of fun. And at that time, I thought, I've made a really good move here. This is quite an interesting job.
Yeah, all they do is drink.
More. I want to do this more.
What's you do in the afternoons? Go to the spa?
Yeah, but there was no one talked about finance, no one talked about any of that sort of stuff. That was kind of like my segue into hospitality, and I thought, yeah, I've really got a good job here. And so in those days, you just did lots of really fun things. If you're an Australian rugby supporter, I was on first name basis with people like John Eales, Dave Wilson. I debated against Ian Healy, all of these kind of things. They were just really, really fun times. And you had a box at everything to what it is now. We're very restrictive, very corporate. You would never dream of doing the lunch. You might every now and then, but even then you think twice about it. So that was an interesting time, and you definitely saw a lot of fun things. In running hotels, it's very specific to the location. The things that you experience in, say, Thailand are different to what you experience in Indonesia versus Malaysia, some of which I can't really repeat so much because I think it would be censored. But I think the overarching thing is that there are a lot of guests that I've dealt with over the years that I'm still in contact with. And if I was to say to you, that's the thing I miss the most, it probably is. And there's people from all around the world. Like there's a gentleman that comes to my mind that would build horse racing courses. And he and I have kept in contact for years and years and years. And he was one of my loyal guests that I met. So you just meet really good people, and they've all got a story. They've definitely all got a story. But I think the thing I'd like to tell you, I met my husband in Nanjing.
Tell us that story.
Oh no, that's also censored.
Oh, come on, come on.
No,
this is like cable, the IAG podcast. Very
yeah,
open.
Sure. No, I was lucky. So here I go. I leave Brisbane, 1.6 million. I go to Nanjing. I try to figure it all out, and I meet an Englishman that had moved from Newcastle who was building a plant for his company. So there you go. So good things happen in all places, right? So that was a nice thing with Nanjing. So he taught me how to bowl.
Oh,
as in Tim.
Because I'd never bowled, right?
Okay,
you mentioned Janet. Some great guests you've had over the years. You must have had some shocking guests too. No doubt. You got stories about some, guests, things they've done or things you'd rather not have seen, or.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So some guests get a little bit carried away in rooms. Different places have different appeal to different guests. So yes, you see all sorts of things. Actually, I think the most I've seen has been in Macau. The bigger the room count, the higher the risk, right? So it's a very interesting environment here. So it's been very interesting along my journey. Definitely. I think the one thing I can probably tell you about is in Nanjing. And, I was a greenie. I'd just moved to China. And one of the biggest customers was an Italian car company. And in Nanjing, they used to manufacture all their cars. And so a lot of our business had a long stay component. And one of these gentlemen unfortunately passed away, had a heart attack on the 24th of December. So here I am 6 months into my stint translating with the Italian officials, because I speak Italian, and my secretary translating my English into her Chinese to try and get the body back home for the family. So that's more of a sad thing. But it was an interesting foray for me, because in Brisbane, you don't see that stuff, right? So it was very interesting. And, I started in hotels when you telexed everything. So I'm way back. We used to talk to the fax machine thinking that it could help. I think that was definitely under the influence.
I remember the first fax we ever received in the office. We're all standing around the fax machine.
Yeah.
How does it work? It's amazing. In our generation, we've seen the arrival of the fax machine and the death of the fax machine too.
Correct. Yeah. And the franking machine, right?
Franking machine.
Now really showing my age. Yeah.
Wow, that's a blast in the past.
Yeah.
Do you remember what a franking machine is? Ben might be young.
I don't even know.
Postage. So when you get a letter and it doesn't have a stamp, it's got a red ink thing on it. That's a franking machine. Yeah, we used to have those.
There you go.
So Janet, tell us, you've been living in Macau for 5 years, or coming on 5 years now. Yeah. How do you, some people love working in Macau, some less so. How do you find, just as forgetting about the job for the moment, just living in Macau, like places to eat, things to do, and how do you feel about it?
I love it here. Having lived in some of the places that I have, I think it's really easy. Our proximity to Hong Kong and Shenzhen, to be able to fly out to Vietnam for 2 or 3 days, it's really terrific. I think I like to do the trails at Koh Luan, and all of those I really enjoy. I tend to get up in the morning and go for a run. Past Altira and all that way. I like doing that. I just think it's a very easy place to live, easy to get around. We're spoilt with no traffic. When you compare it, having lived in Bangkok, honestly, if it was a rainy day, it was quite difficult to get from A to B. So I think we're very spoilt here, spoilt for choice on good restaurants, lots of good restaurants to go to. The only thing I would love to see is more places where you could take your dog. that are dog friendly, being a dog lover, and I have a little puppy, so that would be a nice introduction. But I think the world is still figuring out how to do that. In Europe, they've got it. You can take your puppy in most places, but here not so much. So I really enjoy it here, and I make sure I travel into Europe once a year and go. I always tend to go back to my Italian roots, and I enjoy doing that very much.
I guess we should also mention that both you and I are on the board of AusCham Macau, Australian Chamber of Commerce in Macau. I mean, what do you think about being an Australian that works in Macau, as we all are, to a greater lesser extent? I mean, how do you feel about the relationship between Australia and Macau, and what we're doing in AusCham Macau, and where that organisation is still quite new, right?
Yes.
Where we're going with that?
I think it's the first great move that was done was to have our own chamber here for Macau, for Australians, and I think you're quite right. It's still in its young stages, but I think the option for Australians, in particular, I think a lot of what we talk about is in that food and beverage area, is a super opportunity for us here in Macau, because the volumes across all of our properties is substantial and can definitely drive some trade between the two areas. I think for our membership here, I think the camaraderie that we can build throughout. I mean, our Australia Day event was 100 persons strong, which shows that there's a real appetite for people to get, Australians like to sit down, like to have a drink, like to have something good to eat. And our event was, I think, a sure sign of that. And then as far as our Anzac Day, where we don't forget some of the traditions that we've got. So I think the chamber, as it starts to evolve, will be great and good for Macau and good for us as Australians.
So, Jeanette, what's sort of coming up for you now in terms of like the reopening and so forth? We talked a little bit about before, but there seems to have been a change in the mood. I mean, we were a few weeks ago in the COVID-19 thing. It was like, when will this ever end? And we had no idea. But now there really seems to be a change in the mood in terms of it feels like there's lots of signs coming that it's reopening. So, internally, are you finding that your staff are getting more excited about trying to get back to some semblance of normalcy, and like your occupancy levels, are they any different, or is it all just sort of preparation? What's going on in terms of starting to think about ramp up again?
Right, we've got recovery plans ready, down to or whatever we want to do, visuals, etc. I think the thing is that even when borders, etc., open, I think it'll be slow. And I think it needs to be slow, because if it's too much too quick, you don't know whether we'll be in harm's way. I think for our associates, we just need to be a little bit more patient. I personally, when I look at the occupancies into July and August, it's not going to be back in full force around those times. So I think my major prerogative is to make sure that we get us to a stage where we continue to keep all of our workforce, keep them safe. But I do think that the recovery will be a little bit slower. It's not going to come in at 100% overnight. But we are ready with our recovery plans.
So if you were to, I mean, it is crystal ball gazing, but it's always good to hear from senior executives what they think. I mean, if you were to guess when things might return to, say, 2019 levels, are we talking Q4? Are we talking next year? I mean, some people even say 2022. What's your feeling in just talking to people?
Just a thumb suck from myself. I think Q1, when we start to go into Chinese New Year, we might next year, which is around the 12th of February, we might start to see a little bit more traffic. I think people are going to be very cautious, and all of that is predicated on the fact that we have the next 6 months with no cases, people not in harm's way, etc. I think it depends which way, and I think the Macau government's doing a great job. They're measuring their decisions on a timely basis, and I think it's right to do that because there's a global environment, right? If you look at what's happening around the world, a lot of places are still not out of the woods. So I do think we need to be cautious. I am hopeful that Q1 next year will be maybe not to 2019 levels, but will be a lot better than 2020 levels.
I mean, the nightmare scenario is that we open up and then we have another wave and it's all over again, you know.
Correct.
I mean, that would just be a disaster. Or even 2 or 3 times it happens.
Right.
Which, if you look 100 years ago to the Spanish flu, that's what happened. You know,
exactly.
they had a few waves over a 2-year period. So...
Right, and I think, you know, there was in September or something, there's a vaccine that some of the scientists in Australia are working on. So I think a lot of it's also dependent on what happens within the medical field. So I do think, as painful as it is, being cautious is the right approach, but it changes every day. And I think that's what we've got to be very agile to be able to meet the needs of that.
Yeah, it's one of the difficult things. I mean, I know Liviana, who's with us on the board, said he's really only planning 2 weeks at a time because you can't plan any much beyond that. What do you? I mean, just expanding beyond Macau now and just talking generally. I mean, have you seen such a big thing happen in the world? I can't even think of anything in the world in my lifetime that's been so all pervasive across the whole world that's affected everybody in such a big way. I mean, can you think of it?
No, not to this scale. I mean, I was in Nanjing when SARS happened, but I never being like this. I was also in Bali for the second bombing.
Right.
You know,
right.
And so that was also a different dilemma. But that was a little bit more. The bombing was a bit more specific, right? Because it was only in one area. This is, I think, unprecedented, and I do think that. From my own personal perspective, I'm cautious to make a lot of comment about when it will come back, when it won't come back, because actually I don't know. What I do know is that I can be prepared, and I can prepare my workforce, and I can take care of my workforce. They're the things that are in my control. And then it's just about working with the Macau government and working with Marriott and Sands and everybody to make sure that we're ready for whatever comes our way.
I mean, even it's amazing where Ben's in Australia at the moment, and you can't get out of the country. There's no flights in or out. It's just incredible, isn't it?
And they're talking in Australia at the moment that they may not be in the international flight till the end of the year because they're being very cautious. They're very cautious. So I think it's very possible that 2021 before international flights out of Australia, because we're doing quite well here. So, and governments around the world, Macau's being very cautious too at the moment.
Yeah.
I think that's the way of the world.
I do think that's the right approach though, because we don't know. If we knew, well then that would be it, but we don't.
Isn't it interesting the difference between governments? Like some governments, like Macau's doing really well, Australia's doing pretty well, but South Korea's done very well.
New Zealand.
But New Zealand's done excellently, but, America's quite frankly done poorly. Most of Europe's done very badly. There's a really big difference between how countries, even Boris Johnson getting coronavirus and a couple of people in Trump's White House it's pretty amazing stuff. If you'd said that was going to happen beforehand, you wouldn't have believed it.
Yeah. I think I obviously can't comment for what's happened in the other countries. I think I went home for my leave. We were all taking leave to clear the books in February. And it was interesting because when I went home, people were in Australia, and Ben, you might talk to this, people were walking around in the end of February, I went, like, it wasn't really ever going to touch Australia. I felt that there was a real, and because we were in it and in the thick of it and exhausted by it, it was kind of almost surreal that they were thinking that way. And it was just as I left that it heightened then in Australia, which is obviously when you went back. I just think that around the world, people just didn't think it would go that far. How would we have known?
Even the Olympics being postponed. Who ever heard of that? It's such a major... We don't feel so bad now about some of our small events being postponed. They postponed the Olympics. It's just amazing.
That's a big deal, right? And the F1, if you're an F1 lover like myself.
Yeah, and in Australia, I think it became real to Australians when they...
Oh, yeah, the football.
Sport, any sport. Well, that's the other thing, there's no sport.
But, now we'd be watching the State of Origin, right? It'd be nearly season, the second series.
It'd be coming up for sure. So it's... We've sort of forgotten about that at the moment.
Well, it's affected. I mean, we're in the gaming industry to a certain extent, being in Macau, and there's no sports betting going on. So it's just, talk about pent-up demand. The pent-up demand to have a bet is going to be massive when... but I think people maybe perhaps over-talk pent-up demand a little bit. I mean, for sure there's going to be an initial burst of activity. but how long will that last? Will it just be maybe 3 weeks, and then the fear factor will set in, as you talked about before, Janet? People being concerned, and unfortunately, our industry. They talk about the beach industries, which is lots of bookings, entertainment, casinos, hotels, cruises, that sort of thing. Really, they're the complete opposite of essential, aren't they? I mean, they're fun, but they're not essential. So why take a risk?
Well, I was just talking how the tourism and hotels and flights, all of that stuff, it's all interrelated. So, I think some of the airline literature I've read is saying that, they'll limit their yield on flights. I don't know how easy that is to do financially. And so, people have to get somewhere, like Ben may not be able to come back. Well, that's the key thing with driving tourism. We hope you do, right? But these are all interrelated. So I think what we're seeing in Marriott within our China area, there's a lot of domestic travel, there's a lot of drive travel, a lot of staycations where there's weekend traffic, a lot of business on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. People are looking at dining in hotels. So I think people, first and foremost, might venture out to where they can get to themselves, which might, for us, means Hong Kong.
Well, I mean, just very simple calculation. If they take all the middle seats out of a plane, well, that's 1/3 of the seats. The prices have all got to go up 50%. I mean, that's very simplistic, but it's probably not a bad ballpark.
Right. There was something I read not so long ago saying that the cheaper flight market, where travel has been very accessible for all levels of all socioeconomic levels, might be curtailed a little bit. Now, that's just in something I read. Whether that's true or not, I think remains to be seen.
It seems to make sense, though, doesn't it? I mean, a $20 flight, $50 flight, these low-cost flights, they're not going to make sense unless there's huge volume. How can you have huge volume?
Right. But, and again, it's not about Macau, but if you look at what Australia's doing with New Zealand and trying to keep it across those two areas, it makes sense. And I think it's good government thinking. And for us, we have a similar thing, although there's no air travel between us and Hong Kong. So I think those things, and perhaps it'll go a bit further afield, vice versa. So these sort of things, I hope, will help us here in Macau.
Very good. Well, I think we've gone over an hour. So
yes.
I think we're just about done, aren't we?
Yeah, I think that's we've got a good stint.
Yeah, we've got a very good stint there. Well, thank you very much, Janet.
Thank you both very much. Yes,
it's really nice chatting to you, and I think we've had a very successful IAG podcast #1.
Well, it's a great initiative. Thank you for keeping me top of mind. I'm very honoured to be your #1.
Oh, no,
and I wish you all the success with it.
Thank you very much. No, we're very lucky to have you. So that's it for us. Until next time, we'll see you for the IAG podcast #2, which you'll be able to no doubt see I'm coming through on Breakfast Briefing. Okay, so see you. Bye, Ben.
Bye, Ben. Thanks very much, Andrew.
Okay, bye for now.
Cheers.
Okay, bye.
Bye.